Acheron will send all her enemies to therapy, and today I will show you how to build her best. Let's get into it. 4-piece Diver is the best in slot relic set for our pathological serial killer.
Here's Johnny.
It is about 7% better than running her next best set, which is Sizzling Thunder. The Diver set meshes well with her kit, which wants you to have enemies debuffed. The 2-piece gives a 12% damage increase to any enemy that has at least one debuff. A debuff can be a lot of things like resistance, speed, or defense reductions, just to mention a few. Or a plain old DOT can do the trick, so it's very easy to keep the passive up. The 4-piece effect gives her 4% crit rate unconditionally, but on top grants her either 8% crit damage or 12% for having 2 or 3 debuffs on enemies respectively. So here it's clear that you need a team that is able to get debuffs out in AoE fashion. This is one of the reasons why Pella is a staple character for Acheron, but it doesn't stop here. If Acheron herself applies a debuff, it will double the 4-piece effects. So in reality, you can get 8% crit rate and up to 24% crit damage, which is pretty strong. The only downside with this set is that you will be farming Watchmaker pieces, which are very neat, but that's it. If you're dedicated to Acheron, then you will build your new home in the Dream Dive Cavern for the next months. But until then, you can survive using 4-piece Sizzling Thunder. It's nowhere near as strong as Diver, since it only gives you a measly 10% lightning damage and 20% attack. That's the reason why I consider this only transitory on your way to global domination with Acheron. 2-piece sets include 2-piece Pioneer, Attack Percent, Wild Wheat and Prisoner, Lightning Damage bonus, and Hacker Space. If for some reason you don't even have Sizzling Thunder, or you only have a couple of good Diver pieces, you can even consider combinations of 2-piece Diver, Wild Wheat, Sizzling, and Hacker Space. Best is to combine an existing 2-piece Diver with any other good 2-piece you have. If you haven't farmed any Diver or Sizzling set for some mystical reason, or what you own is just horrendously dog poop, you will find 2 very odd sets you can use on her with the 4-piece Genius and Hunter sets. They are odd because the 2-piece effects are useless to Acheron, but do not get fooled into thinking that they are much worse in her best in slot. In fact, they are only 9% and 11% worse respectively. Let me give a pro tip. If, for example, you own a cracked Quantum set and a nuclear inert Salsado because you farmed these crappy domains for months just to end up benching your mid-Sailor, you can take those sets off and put them on your shiny new and much better Sailor, who now goes by the name of Acheron for some reason. Yes, combined, they are 11% worse than her best in slot set. But really, 11% is not that big of a deal, to be honest. Especially if you just think of how many weeks and months you need to farm just to get them to a serviceable level. An inert Salsado is actually only a tiny bit worse, so you don't need to replace that one at all. I'm not saying don't farm her new sets, just take your time with them. And don't feel pressured to think that you need to have the top of the line best in slot sets right here, right now, come on now, to play your Acheron. Just use your resources more wisely by properly and fully building your Lightcone, levels, and traces first, and then go farm the heck out of her new sets. Look at the last step as a refinement process once you have the basics down. Fun fact, Acheron is an extremely old word for hell.
Until we meet again.
Anyways, now let's look at the 2-piece sets. The Izumo Gensei is easily her best in slot set, but it's not by a huge margin compared to her next best option. It's literally only 2% better than Inert Salsado, so there's that. What is good with that domain is that the other set is very good for Pure Fiction. The set meshes well for playstyle at E0. As long as you have any other Nihility unit in her team, it will give her 12% crit rate, which tremendously helps her. And you out, as she gets only crit damage from her traces. On top, you also get 12% attack from the Izumo set, which isn't too shabby. I think the 20% crit rate provision you get from the Diver and Izumo sets are the most compelling arguments, as they remove a lot of pressure from building your Acheron, so by farming them you will already have a 52% crit rate to boot when you get a crit rate body piece, which removes a lot of pressure from your relic substats. So if you have just started out farming them, you will get your Acheron at least faster online, which is pretty good news. A decent alternative is Inert Salsado. As mentioned, it is only slightly behind Izumo, so if you already have a good set, just use that. It still gives you 8% crit rate, which is unconditional, but once you cross the 50% crit rate threshold, it also gives you 15% increased damage on your ultimate and follow-up attacks. The follow-ups part is useless on Acheron, of course, but the increased ult damage isn't too shabby. The major downside of this set is that Universe 6 gives the freaking Bellabog defense set, which isn't that useful for anybody but Japard and Fire Trailblazer. So if you don't already own a cracked set, you're better off farming Izumo straight up, as it does give you the Sigonia 2-piece, which I mentioned before. You can even use Sigonia on Acheron if you take her to Pure Fiction. With the 40% crit damage it gives you, you need to make sure that you still have enough crit rate. But one way or the other, your stamina is spent on this domain much better. Now let's talk about Acheron's main stats and substats. For her body, if you play her at E0, you want to go for a crit rate body 9 out of 10 times, as she backchests crit damage hard for traces already. And as I mentioned before, you get easily 52% crit rate to boot before substats if you build the Diver and Izumo sets on her. If you go for Eidolons, you can use a crit damage body instead, as her E1 gives you 18% crit rate. So now, should you go for attack or speed boots for Acheron's boots? Let's say you want to squeeze out one more burst from your Acheron by switching to speed. Okay, let me tell you this. If you're running a 4-star Lightcone like Fermata or Goodnight Sleepwell, you can go speed boots if it takes you 4 or 5 cycles to clear a mock chamber, as that will unlock another burst. But if you clear in 3 cycles or faster, both pieces will be about even. As for signature weapon, go for attack percent boots, as they perform consistently better by speed by about 8% no matter what, if it takes you 0 or 6 cycles to clear. Your balls and rope are easy. Balls can be lightning damage or attack, they are pretty much equal on Acheron. Whatever has the better stats, you should use. The rope needs to be attack percent and you're golden. You have a pretty good Acheron once you hit the following stats. For your substats, you want to get crit and attack percent as much as you can. If you can get some speed here and there, it's fine, very simple stuff. Now let's look at Acheron's weapons. Her signature Along the Passing Shore did seriously catch a lot of strays. Oh boy. This is because some of you players out there are afraid that you need it to do good damage with Acheron. Acheron can 3-cycle Mock with the most dirt cheap team you can imagine, featuring Sampo, Pella, and Fire MC, and most importantly using a freaking S5 Fermata at that. Yes, Pella and Fire MC need the Resolution and Universal Market Lightcones respectively to achieve that, but come on. If you can beat the hardest content in the game within 3 or more cycles using that team and a Fermata Lightcone, you don't need her signature. But enough ranting, let's unpack the details. The weapon, besides having greater base stats, gives you flat out 36% crit damage without questions asked. On top, when Acheron hits enemies, they will be inflicted with Mirage Fizzle, a debuff which lasts for 1 turn. The effect can only trigger once per target and results in Acheron dealing a 24% increased damage to targets that are inflicted with the Mirage debuff. Her ult will also deal an extra 24% increased damage on top. But you can right away forget about the term limit or the Mirage stuff. The wording is just super confusing. What it should say is whenever Acheron slaps, you will get these bonuses on top regardless, because that's how it actually works. The debuff gets reapplied every time when she attacks anyways. They could have as well made the description unconditional. Now, how much does it help her? That depends a lot if you can get an extra burst with it or not. In 6 cycles, it will add 1 whole ultimate guaranteed, getting you from 6 to 7, raising her contributions to stacks from 12% to 22%. Combined with the other perks, it adds up to a substantial amount. Therefore, it's at its best will be a whole 30 to 40% stronger than S5 Goodnight Sleepwell. But without the extra burst advantage, that shrinks down to a 10 to 15% at max. However, does that matter if you will be able to 1-cycle anyway with the S5 Goodnight Sleepwell on 412? The 4-star Lightcone isn't weak, it's just the 5-star being that strong. So with that being said, Goodnight Sleepwell is as of now her best 4-star option. The condition to get up to 72% damage increase are simple to fulfill, as you'll put lots of debuffs on the enemy anyway with Acheron. If you happen to own an S5, you're absolutely golden. Congratulations! The only Lightcones that are stronger are Kafka's and Silver Wolves. And with Kafka's Lightcone, it's a similar situation like her signature. At its best, it will only be 18% weaker than her signature, which that is at its best. That is because Kafka's Lightcone applies debuffs as well, and therefore you get extra stacks towards her burst. And with that, you really need to squeeze out an extra burst out of your Acheron to get that power. If you don't, for reasons like team composition or your run just being suboptimal, you won't get that advantage, which makes it fall off from the 2nd spot. And let's be real, whoever has that cone will most certainly use it on Kafka anyway most of the time. However, the option is there. Another tip, You can use Kafka's Lightcone on Black Swan if you're playing Black Swan with Acheron. That way you can not only apply Wind DOT, but you can also apply Chalk DOT on the enemy. Thank me later. If you don't have the Signature or S5 Goodnight Sleepwell, your next best choices will be Welt's Lightcone at S1 or S5 Fermata, both performing neck and neck. Fermata still manages to land within 67% of the Signature's power level, provided that you use Black Swan or Sampo to trigger its passive. With this weapon, you need to apply Shock or Wind Shear to make full use of it, and Acheron can only apply Shock when she breaks an enemy, while Black Swan and Sampo don't need any breaks to apply Wind Shear. If you use Sampo, however, you will deal less damage with Acheron, and the Lightcone will drop down to about 57% of the Signature's power level, which still lets you 3-cycle floor 12 by the way. Yeah, Acheron's just that good. Black Swan gets you better results as she gets more stacks for Acheron. As for her teams, don't sweat it. She actually has some really good options despite her absolutely wanting 2 Nihility units at E0, and the 4th member will be, in most cases, a sustain unit. However, there are comps even at E0 that only run 1 Nihility unit. One of the most dirt cheap teams you can run is Acheron, Pela, Gwynathan, and Fire MC. It's hard to get any more cheap than that. If you want to be super cheap, you put Fermata on Acheron and you're pretty much ready to roll. If you want to go premium, the strongest team, with the exception of Welt Sustain, would be Acheron, Black Swan, Pela, or Gwynathan, and finally Gallagher for the sustain role. With Pela, Acheron, and Black Swan will deal more personal damage, and with Gwynathan, both will deal less damage, but if Gwynathan is built well, she will provide enough damage of her own to make up for it. Both variants are neck and neck in terms of damage. You want to run the Resolution Lightcone on either Pela or Gwynathan to add an extra source of debuffs for Acheron. Black Swan's an interesting case. Why is this unit so good? Why is she so damn hot? First of all, she provides a lot of damage of her own, which is in the realm of at least 1/3 to 50% of what Acheron provides. She can create Slash Dreams and Crimson Knot stacks for Acheron by using her normals, skill, or burst. But Black Swan's Arcana stacks themselves don't provide anything for Acheron while they tick up. Let's say new enemies enter the field. No stacks for Acheron. Nada niente. Same when Arcana stacks blow up, but you get extra stacks when Kafka detonates Black Swan's DOT with her skill. One of her main attractions is her ability to put Epiphany on enemies, which makes them take a lot more damage. You want to put that burst down before you cast Acheron's burst, but note that it takes Black Swan a lot longer to recharge her ult compared to Acheron. You will inevitably see some Acheron bursts without that buff. Therefore, timing is key to make it count. Black Swan will become even a stronger luxury support with her E1, as that reduces enemies' defense, and remember that tip I stated earlier with Kafka's Lightcone. Now, Pela specifically is absolutely pivotal to Acheron. She's absolutely easy to get and sits on Acheron's first banner. It doesn't get any more free to play. Her defense shred adds so much damage to Acheron, and that while being dirt cheap to build. She only needs to provide the defense shreds and doesn't need any crazy investment to be very useful. In her teams, Acheron will solely do the hard work. With Black Swan, it will be split among the two. Even if your Acheron is E2, you can still make great use of Pela. She can apply 3 types of debuffs by herself, allowing Acheron to stack incredibly fast. That is through her burst, her E4 plus skill, and through the usage of a Resolution Lightcone. Resolution allows her to apply that 3rd debuff with a normal attack, so even if you only have it at S1, you still have the value you need to justify using it. If you use that Lightcone, make sure to get the Lightcone debuff off of her first normal attack, and then use her skill or burst to add another debuff. Gwynathan can be run as an alternative to Pela, but you're also able to run Pela and Gwynay together, and you will still have a pretty strong team in case you don't own Black Swan or just want to work with Kafka in another team. Gwynathan doesn't just apply debuffs for Acheron, but is also able to amplify her damage by making enemies take more damage from her Fire Kiss ability. So here we have a similar case to Black Swan. As mentioned though, you will be forced to put some investment into her to bring out her own damage. So therefore, she only becomes a priority to build if you don't own Black Swan and really want to fill that second Nihility spot. Gwynathan also gets pretty solid at E6. Now you can run Kafka here with Black Swan, but chances are that it will be weaker than just running Black Swan with Pela and Gwynathan. You will run out of skill points fairly soon, so keep that in mind. It can work, it's just very expensive and not that worthwhile. I mentioned before about Welt Sustain. He's a special case here. A team with this guy, Pela, and Sparkle will give you the strongest Acheron team, but it's also flat out the most difficult to play. He can take the role of your budget sustainer, which opens up a slot to run Sparkle. He applies 10 debuffs, amps Acheron's damage, and adds of course a respectable amount of damage by himself. As much as most of you would love to use Harmonies, you will be extremely limited here. The only truly viable one is Sparkled in the mentioned Welt team. If you replace a Nihility for Sparkle, it will at best case be just as good as running a cheaper Nihility, and the amount of investment you will need is very high. At this point, you're just brute forcing things. However, if for some reason Hoyoverse decides to make a Nihility 5-star Pella that can heal, yeah, that'd be something. It would change everything! So there is definitely room for improvement for Acheron here. Now as for Sustainers, we've already covered Welt, but your best bet would be running either Gallagher as a healer, or go with Fire MC, Japard, or March 7 for the preservation route. Bourgeois is possible too, but is a weaker option compared to the other three as she has no debuffs in her kit. Gallagher is amazing as he offers debuffs from his ult and empowered basics. He's also very good on Acheron's banner and could be chosen from the selector, which makes him a very good pick right away. He generates a lot of skill points for the team on top. So if for example you really want that Black Swan Kafka duo, you would be well off using him as a sustainer. He's not as strong as a healer as Loocha, but you'll still manage. Fire MC, Japard, and March 7th are very interesting as they all offer debuffs in their kit, especially when you use Trend of Universal Market on them to help Acheron get even more stacks. Fire MC can abuse that Lightcone and make the most out of him as she can taunt. Japard can raise his own aggro, and March 7th can freeze, but the chance of that happening is not as high, therefore she's the weakest pick here. Her shield can raise aggro, but you would be forced to use it on her to abuse the mechanic, which on the flip side means she won't protect her team. Now let's head over to Acheron's fine kit. This lightning Nihility lady is packed with goodies. But her normals ain't one of those. You could ignore them and leave them at level 1. Her skill is more interesting. It's what happens when you steal Scylla's ultimate animation and repurpose it for Acheron and add a black hole on top of it. It's a blast that can hit up to 3 targets of lightning damage, and as usual the main target will eat the most of it. Now the damage isn't that crazy. By itself, it only contributes about 12 to 15% of her total damage output. Leveling the skill will only raise the damage, that's it. As the output is so low, you can consider leveling it last. The most important thing it does is creating one so-called Crimson Knot stack and one /Dream stack when you hit a target. Both of these stacks are important for her ultimate. When we go over her talent, you will get a picture of what they do. First of all, it tells us that you need 9 /Dream stacks to use her burst. You can see these stacks as a replacement to energy, which makes her unique in this game. The skill here is only one source of these stacks, and they do not get reduced when you're hit by enemies that suck energy, which is cool. The Crimson stacks are marks that accumulate on your enemies. You can see that number right over their heads. As mentioned, they get applied when you hit enemies with your skill. In multi-target, a new stack will always go to the guy who's the most already, and in total there can only be 9 on enemies, either all on one enemy or shared among some. If an enemy dies or leaves the field, the stacks will move to the next guy who is the second highest stack count. Besides the skill, there is another way to get stacks for Acheron. This is very important as the skill itself would take forever to unlock her burst. Whenever any unit in her team applies a debuff on an enemy, a stack will go towards her /Dreams, unlocking her burst faster. Add 1 stack of Crimson Knot, that will apply on the enemy it hit. If a debuff hits multiple enemies, the knot will go to the enemy with the highest stack count. Now there is a lot of things in the game that count as debuffs, not just DLTs. There are many sources, let me list a few. Weakness breaks, slows, attack reduction, defense reductions, resistance reductions, taunts, and freezes. There's probably more that I've forgotten about. All of these things will create stacks for Acheron, and it doesn't matter if the source is an ability, a Lightcone passive, or maybe future relics that apply any sort of debuff. That's why your team building is so focused on getting as many stacks as possible in the shortest amount of time. Before we go over what the heck these Crimson Knot stacks actually do, let's wrap up the talent. There's one more thing that it does. When you use Acheron's ultimate, it will reduce all enemy resistance types by up to 20% if you level it completely, and it will also make her ultimate reduce toughness, bars, no matter the weakness type, which is pretty sick. Alright, now let's go over to the ultimate now. As you should know by now, that's the main meat of her entire kit, makes up 85% of Acheron's entire damage. It's one hell of a flashy ability, and single-handedly power-crept all of her burst animations in Hawkeye's Star Rail. It's that insane. As mentioned, you need 9 /Dreams to unlock it. Now in this mode, Acheron will drop 4 massive nukes on top of the enemy, with the last being the most powerful. The first 3 attacks are called Rain Blades. The Rain Blades deal a modest amount of 24% of Acheron's attack to a single target, so by themselves, they're not that impressive. But here's where the Crimson Knots come into play. By now, you will have 9 knots either all on one target or spread among some targets. Every time a Rain Blade slashes the main target with the most stacks, you will see 3 knots removed at a time. Every single knot that is removed will deal damage to all enemies that are on the field. Note that while the Rain Blades go down, other enemies will have their own stacks remain untouched until the finale. The first knot has a 15% attack scaling at level 10, while every stack that gets removed, the scaling will increase. So by the time you remove the very last stack, it will be 60% of Acheron's attack. That's why you see the damage numbers go up with every attack. Now, for the finisher, we have a fourth attack that is different from the previous three. Its name is Stygian Resurge. It's a nice nuke with 120% attack scaling at level 10, and one of its main jobs is to remove all the remaining stacks that have been untouched so far on the upper enemies. With each of the leftover stacks hitting every single enemy that is on the field, the last attack is so strong that you often see it doubling whatever damage you had before. Now, you may have noticed that the small fries have their HP bar deleted way before Acheron is done with her 4-hit combo, but they will just chill there with 0 HP until the burst is over, so you'll technically have a lot of overkill damage that will inflate the final damage number. But that waste doesn't matter, as every knot always hits each and every enemy on the field. So okay, the ultimate's awesome. But that's certainly not all for her goodies. Her traces are packed. Her Ascension 2 trace Red Oni makes sure that Acheron starts all her battles with 5 stacks of Slash Dreams to boot, helping her to get her first burst extremely quickly. You will also see 5 stacks of Crimson Knot appear on a random enemy. On top of all the XX stacks you may collect, and go into a separate counter called Quadrivalent Ascendance. You can have up to 3 excess stacks which allow you to burst a little later, which can be very helpful to get a Pala burst off or a Black Swan burst. The overflow stacks will be added to the count of your next burst. For Ascension 4, the Abyss trace is crazy. It gives Acheron a massive 155 to 150% damage increase, but the price to pay for it is so much power that you need to have 1 or 2 Nihility units in your team, mostly 2. Since you need them anyways to stack up her burst, it's not that bad of a restriction, but that didn't stop the community from giving Acheron a lot of flack. Her Ascension 6 Thundercore will increase Acheron's damage whenever her hits land on enemies with not stacks during her ult. The buff will last for 3 turns. Every slash will increase her damage by 30% for up to 3 times. That means the first ultimate won't deal the full damage, as you still need to ramp up the stacks, but her damage afterward, and especially the next ultimate that still follow within that 3-turn limit, will also see the benefit of a 90% damage increase. It's a huge trace. On top, when Stygian Resurge triggers, which is her finisher move, it will hit one unlucky random guy with a lightning strike. This occurs 6 times. So, the same guy can get extremely unlucky 6 times. Or others. That damage is considered part of her ultimate damage, so it adds up to that one big number in the end. As for her talent priorities, you want to level her burst, then her talent, and then her skill, and just don't bother with her normals. Now with that out of the way, let's talk Eidolons. Acheron's E1 gives her a simple 18% crit rate, which leads to a 5% overall damage increase. Decent con to make a crit damage body viable or to make it easier to build Acheron. It's nice, but if you're wondering whether you should go for Eidolon or a Lightcone, hands down, it is the Lightcone. Her A2 will get you the single-handedly best increase you can get on her. It reduces the amount of Nihility units you need and compensates for some of your loss from not having that unit a little bit by providing Acheron with 1 Slash Dream and 1 Crimson Knot stack when the unit's turn starts. For example, if you take your Acheron, Black Swan, and Pella and replace Pella with Sparkle, you will see a massive damage increase of 77% from the previous Eidolon. It's the Raiden Shogun C2 beta all over again. Her E3 will upgrade your burst to normals, a 5% increase in damage from the E2. Her E4 will make your enemies take 8% more damage, overall 6% increase in damage. Her E5 does almost nothing with 2% from E4 as it improves your skill. Her E6 is the second biggest damage spike, increasing the all res penetration from 20% to 40% for her ultimate. On top, your skills and basics will now be considered ultimate damage. And most importantly, will now reduce toughness of enemies regardless of their weakness type. This con is a 22% improvement from her E5 state. In total, all of her cons will improve Acheron's damage by almost 160%, meaning that if you dealt 1.9 million damage in 3 turns, you will now sit on a whopping 4.9 million. It's absurd, nobody needs that much power. Acheron is without a doubt a top tier damage carry. Her floor is already very high, and she can already perform at really high levels of free-to-play teams and weapons. You can 3-cycle the hardest content with such. With some investment, you will 1-cycle in many situations. Remember, all you need to clear MOC is 5 cycles or less per half, so this unit offers a lot in spades. If you go down the route and invest in Eidolons and her Lightcone, you will end up with ungodly amounts of damage. It's not even funny anymore. Literally, it's just an easy way to kind of remove any challenge Honkai Star Rail could offer you. So unless you want to spend as little time in the game as possible, you're well off staying at E0S1 if you really want at least that Lightcone, but you don't even need to do that. It's up to you. Hope this guide made your Acheron a true emanator of the Nihility. This has been Juice, signing out. And don't let any of this let you forget that Acheron has a phone, yet still doesn't understand Google Maps.